This is Debbie from Lime Doodle Design, and for my Doodling with Debbie feature this month, I've been inspired by the changing seasons to dig out all my flower stamps recently, and today I'll be combining the centre cut flower background stamp with a sentiment from the So Loved set, both by Sam Says Stamp. The centre cut flower stamp has two elements, a frame and a centrepiece, and they can be stamped together or separately. I'll be using just the centrepiece today to stamp and watercolour a border along the bottom of a piece of Archer's cold press watercolour card. But before we get to stamping the border, I want to give the watercolour card a wash of colour first. I often paint my backgrounds after stamping and colouring the focal points, but this stamp has lots of detail going on and the gaps between the flowers is quite small. To get a cohesive background, I thought it best to do the watercolour background first and then paint over the top. So having given the watercolour card a warm wash of yellows and pinky peaches, I placed the card in the misty and lined up the floral image in the bottom corner. I'll be painting the flowers in a no-line style, and so I chose to ink the stamp in antique linen distress ink. This pale ink will give a good guide to paint, while its water-reactive properties mean that it will fade into the painting. Having stamped the image once on the bottom right, I moved the card and lined up the stamp again, but this time in the bottom left. I tried to nestle the image into the first impression so that there were minimal gaps between the two. I think one leaf overlaps, but that is okay as the ink reacts with water. I can choose which part of the overlapping images to paint, and you'll not know they ever overlapped afterwards. I again taped the watercolour card to a board. I did this when painting the background too, and the reason for this is it is to prevent the card from warping when using a lot of water. I certainly needed it when I painted the background, as I liberally applied water then, but possibly less so when painting the flowers as much less water was involved. Okay, so for the background and the painting the focal point flowers, I used Daniel Smith watercolours. For the background wash, I mainly use QUINACRIDONE Gold and QUINACRIDONE Coral. For the leaves, I used in the main Undersea Green, Jadeite Green and a little Lunar Black to deepen the mix for the shadows. For the flowers, I use QUINACRIDONE Coral, PYRROL Scarlet and ALIZARIN Crimson. The benefit of having the warmth of the QUINACRIDONE Gold as the background wash is that anything you paint over the top will pick up the warmth and glow. It's one of the reasons I chose to paint the flowers in a similar colours to the background to get that warmth of tone on tone look. Now I have to say that for a long time I wasn't impressed with where this painting was going. It was a bit of a mess at times, to be honest, and that is why I think there is a lesson in perseverance to be learned, because quite often watercolour paintings look pretty rubbish before they start to improve, and by sticking with them and working at it, then the end result is so worth it. This painting may not be my most favourite ever, but I certainly love how it came together in the end. So while I continue to paint, let's chat about the process I used. With the background wash lending its warm glow to everything, I painted a base layer, first moving around the image so that I wasn't painting two areas next to one another until they were dry. This prevents the colours mixing and blending and can help to separate the two areas. So for example, if I painted two petals next to each other at the same time, the paint would likely pool and gather as one puddle with the colours mixing together, and you'd lose the definition where one petal ended and the next started. However, if one petal is dry when painting the petal next to it, then the paint won't spread over to the dry area and each petal will be more defined. Having got a base layer down, I simply went back in with more layers, deeper in colour, keeping these deeper areas to where shadows would naturally occur, at the base of petals, or where they overlap, or butt up against one another. These would naturally be where you would find shadows, and so that's where I kept the deepest shades. To finish the flower centres, I added black dots and a few flicks radiating out from the centre with more dots on the end to represent flower anthers. I speeded up the drying process for this part with a preheated heat tool and then added dots of white gouache on top. Gouache is an opaque watercolour and you get a lovely bright white highlights with it. I like to add the impression of more flowers and leaves in the distance to fill out the area more. To do this, I used the same colours I'd been using for the flowers and leaves, but diluted them down more with water. Things in the distance are paler, and so painting these leaves and flowers with the diluted mixtures will automatically make them appear as if they're further away. For the leaves, I use the shape of the brush to pull a few leaf-like shapes, starting with a light pressure, then increasing the pressure slightly to get the width of the leaf, and then lifting again to trail off to the leaf tip. I also added some vague flower shapes too. The great thing about painting like this is that the shapes don't need to be precise. The impression of a flower is interpreted by the eye, and so a faint pink blob really does read as a flower in the distance in this context. I finished off the painting with a liberal splatter of perfect pearl solution and also some of the leftover paint. To give more definition to the petals and leaves, I used Faber-Castell pencils to deepen the shadows and define the shapes more. For the sentiment, I used the So Love set, which has some gorgeous sentiments. Now, the safer thing to do with a finished painting would have been to stamp the sentiment on a separate piece and add it to the card in some way. However, I really wanted the sentiment stamped above the floral border, and so I took a gamble and went for it. To give myself the best chance for clean, crisp embossing on this textured watercolour card, firstly, I treated the card with an anti-static powder bag to help prevent embossing powder randomly sticking everywhere. Then I stamped the sentiment several times in clear embossing ink to ensure a good impression. I then sprinkled with antique gold embossing powder from Simon's Stamp and heat set. And actually, considering I was stamping on a textured surface, I was pleased with how this came out. I trimmed the watercolour panel down to be just slightly smaller than an A2 card base, added foam adhesive to the back, and then adhered it to a card base cut and scored from Simon's Stamp ivory card. This is my favourite card as I think it is the closest colour match to the slightly creamy colour of the watercolour card. To finish the card, I added a sprinkling of sequins and pearls from Little Things by Lucy's cards, snuggled in amongst the flowers, and held in place with Gina K Connect glue. And that completes this watercoloured floral border card, which shows a little persistence is worth it when you don't think things are great in the early stages of watercolouring. On the Simon's Stamp blog, you will find a coordinating blog post, as well as details of the supplies I've used today. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.